So with everything that's going on now, a lot of people are worried, is this going to be World War III? And hey, Putin's just insane enough to do that. It's just a good thing that our generals aren't, right? I mean, they'd never be so crazy as to try and get us into a nuclear war, right? Think again. And this is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you may think you know the story of it. So this is back in the days of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. Those big, bad Russians put nuclear missiles in Cuba 90 miles from our border. And what did JFK do about that? Well, thanks to the courage and advice he got from those amazing generals at the Pentagon, he puffed out his chest and he went up to the Russians and he was like, you better remove those missiles or else, because we're the America and we're big and we're tough and, you better stand down. And then they went, oh, yes, we're sorry. We didn't mean to upset you. We'll take the missiles down. Yeah. That's another story that's 100% grade A, all-American fiction. So, what had really happened, and this is a good article a few years ago in Downsized DC, I thought I'd use that to go over this, because people do need to realize the truth about that, and consider that all these Pentagon people, well, they're basically still the same way, so... The Soviet missiles that they put in Cuba in 1962 were a response to missiles that the U.S. had placed in Turkey in 1961, 40 miles from the Russian border. So, and Perry says, if the Soviet missiles in Cuba were so dangerous that they warranted the risk of nuclear war to remove them, then the same was true of the U.S. missiles in Turkey, right? I mean, if it was such a big problem, Russian missiles 90 miles away from us, that we had to go and make a big stink about that. Well, 40 miles away from the Russian border, U.S. missiles in Turkey. Isn't that the same thing? I like this political cartoon that he included. And so you've got Russian guy over there. He's in the shade. The sun is being blotted out from all of these U.S. bases with branches going over him, Turkey, West Germany, and Japan. And yet the U.S. guy is getting all bent out of shape over this tiny little branch, just coming over, casting a little bit of a shadow on his fence that says Cuba. Yeah. The parallels to the current situation are just in your face. So, he goes into a conversation between JFK and his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy. And Kennedy says, why does Khrushchev put these missiles in Cuba? What's the advantage of that? It's just as if we began to put a major number of medium-range ballistic missiles in Turkey. And Bundy says, well, we did it, Mr. President. And of course, Kennedy knew that. He asked for the missiles to be removed from Turkey several times. He knew they were a problem. This should have led him to propose a trade with Khrushchev. We'll withdraw our missiles if we'll remove yours. No missiles, no crisis. But that wasn't what they wanted. It would have been easy. It's like, look, if these missiles are a problem, we take down our missiles, you take down yours. Easy solution, right? But nope. They all wanted instead to invade Cuba. And disturbingly, Bobby Kennedy even proposed a false flag, another battleship Maine, to justify the invasion, and the military experts continued to favor an invasion even when it became clear that nuclear war would result. And I've got a link to this below. This is not Operation Northwoods. It's a different plot. They had Russian replica planes attacking American targets. So, yeah, when you have that and Operation Northwoods, and there are a couple others as well, it's pretty scary, so. Alright, the Pentagon had already studied what the strategic impact would be if nuclear missiles were installed in Cuba. The answer? Absolutely none whatsoever. The Cuban missiles really didn't make a difference at all. The Cuban missiles would not increase the risk of a first strike. The U.S. would still have a huge nuclear advantage. In other words, there was nothing at stake in Cuba. The whole thing was a big nothing burger. This was a made-up crisis embraced for political reasons. Kennedy had used a non-existent missile gap to campaign against Nixon. Then, after JFK was in office, Nixon retaliated by accusing Kennedy of being soft on Cuba. JFK tried to counter those charges by saber-rattling Khrushchev. 1 month before the crisis, Kennedy warned the Soviets that there would be dire consequences if they installed offensive capability in Cuba. But those comments were really aimed at his Republican critics more than Khrushchev. JFK admits his true motivation in taped comments. He says, "Last month I should have said we didn't care about missiles in Cuba, but when we said we were not going to stand for Soviet forces there, and then they go ahead and do it, and then we do nothing." So the so-called missile crisis wasn't about national security. It was about saving face politically, and the lives of every person on Earth were held hostage to that goal. Given the low stakes, you'd think our national security experts would have taken precautions to reduce the risk of accidental war. Not true. They did the exact opposite. They took the military to DEFCON 3. This meant that nuclear weapons were added to U.S. planes all over the world. In some cases, this meant that tactical nukes were the only weapons some planes could use to defend themselves. This greatly increased the chance that a small event could start a global nuclear war, and worse, many of these weapons could be fired without presidential approval. Oh yeah, you know all the talk about the nuclear codes and, oh wow, Trump might still have the nuclear codes, and of course they change those every morning. That's a big nothing burger. But yeah, if you've got nukes on planes where you don't even need that, and a plane to defend itself with the only thing it has, a tac nuke, fires at, something Russian that threatens them, how do you think Putin would respond to that? Or Khrushchev in this case. So, they weren't supposed to be used that way, but they could have been, and the same was true on the Soviet side. A nuclear conflagration could have begun at any moment without an order from Kennedy or Khrushchev. Even worse, the Air Force continued to run U-2 flights close to the Soviet Union, completely unrelated to the crisis. One of these flights went off course and crossed deep into Soviet airspace. It could have been mistaken for the start of a bombing attack. When JFK heard about it, he blew his top, remarking, "There's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." The CIA also continued to run sabotage operations against Cuba during the crisis. These missions were strategically useless. They were more likely to increase rather than reduce support for Castro, and they could have lit the fuse for World War. And it didn't end there. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was dropping practice depth charges on Soviet subs in the Sargasso Sea, trying to force them to the surface. One Soviet commander got so frazzled that he wanted to fire a nuclear torpedo. Fortunately, he couldn't get the political officer Vasily Arkhipov to agree. The whole world owes Arkhipov a huge debt. He prevented a nuclear holocaust. That's how easy it could have started. Now, consider how this self-inflicted crisis ended. It was painted as a U.S. victory, but it was really a defeat for the foreign policy establishment. Kennedy had to give up the missiles in Turkey and agree never to invade Cuba. the goal of deposing Fidel had to be abandoned. So if they just never put the missiles there, or if they had taken them down earlier when Kennedy had wanted to, that wouldn't have happened, and they would have been free to move against Castro. So they ended up worse off than they were because of, all of this blustering and everything. And when you also consider, this was a deal that was worked out. This wasn't, puffing out his chest. This was Kennedy saying, no, I'm not going to do what you say. If we do what you say, it's nuclear war. I want to talk to Khrushchev. Give me Khrushchev on the phone. And they sat down and they worked this out. All right, we'll take down the missiles in Turkey, and we'll agree not to invade Cuba, and you take down the Cuban missiles. That's what they did. They talked to each other. The very thing that, the U.S. and NATO now are saying is the one thing you can't do with Putin. They won't even come to the peace table, won't even talk to the guy. They're making out like it's even treason to want to talk to the guy. But that's how it was always done. And this was Nikita Khrushchev. This guy was not known for being the most reasonable guy or the easiest guy to talk to. And yet it still averted World War III. And because of this, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and what almost happened, they actually put in a phone line, a specific phone line, directly from the White House to the Kremlin. So that if either one of them talked to the other at any time, they could just pick up that special phone. And they'd have the line straight there. And that was the case throughout the rest of the Cold War. And it was always the case that the President of the United States and the Premier of the Soviet Union could talk to each other anytime they want and just talk. That's how wars are ended anyway. At some point, everyone's just going to sit down and talk it out. And talk out peace, so. I don't know why it's so horrible to want that. Okay. Our so-called military experts ignored the fact that the crisis was resolved through a trade. They thought the U.S. show of strength was the key factor. They applied this misunderstanding to Vietnam. They thought military violence could force North Vietnam to negotiate a settlement. But strength and resolve wasn't what worked in the missile crisis, and it didn't work in Vietnam either. And it won't work now in Ukraine. It never works. Learn some history. In short, there was no Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a face-saving crisis. It was the response to the Cuban missiles that created the real danger, not the missiles themselves. Ironically, we still ended up with Soviet missiles just a few miles off our coast inside Soviet subs. So if you push aside the Hollywood mythology, the Cuban Missile Crisis amounts to this. U.S. politicians nearly blew up the world for no reason. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is consistent with the rest of U.S. military history. The actions taken during October 1962 did not defend freedom, they did not defend U.S. security, and they did not make the world a better place. And the same is true right now. In Ukraine, no one is defending freedom. Putin is not defending the freedom of the Russians in the disputed regions. NATO isn't defending the freedom of Ukrainians. No one cares about the Ukrainians. That's not what it's about. That's never what it's about. And someday, people are going to learn. And I hope you did today. That would at least be a start. Thank you so much for watching. Comments for the Comment God, shares for the Share Throne. Please hit like, subscribe, and the bell. As always, go to donate.bogosity.tv for all sorts of ways to support. If you don't want to use PayPal, I really understand with some of the crap that you've been pulling recently. Don't worry, there are plenty of other ways to do it, including becoming a regular supporter at Patreon and Subscribestar. You can become a regular supporter, get these videos early and ad-free, and also all sorts of other benefits. So Check it out. Thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, stay strong and be free.